Well, for more information, we're joined by Portfolio Committee of Justice and Correctional Services member, Advocate Glynnis Breytenbach. Good evening to you. Thanks for your time. Firstly, what do you make of some of the arguments that were made before the Supreme Court of Appeal today? I think particularly kicking off with the Correctional Services Department, its representative, and the understanding of the role of the Medical Parole Board.
Good evening, Kathy. Thanks very much. Well, yes, I don't necessarily agree with the submissions, all the submissions made by Mr. Mpofu. It's very clear that in this instance and from the judgment that set aside the medical parole, that Arthur Fraser was in no position to grant this medical parole. He's not by any stretch of the imagination, he's not a doctor. And his decision was ultra vires. Very clearly, his decision was ultra vires. And the Medical Parole Board, in these circumstances, has the final say. So, if there is a negative finding by the Medical Parole Board, in other words, that you don't qualify for medical parole, then that's the end of the matter. And Fraser was way out of his bounds of his authority to, in fact, override that and grant the medical parole. The arguments made by him at the time were that Mr. Zuma needed to be in close proximity to tertiary medical care. Well, I mean, that was clearly made a mockery of when he hopped into a car and went home to Nkandla, which is miles and miles, hundreds of kilometers away from any tertiary medical institution. So that's just not true, and it harks back to the days of Shabir Sheikh, who was granted medical parole in our view prematurely, and is now running around golf courses hale and hearty. So the matter is still ongoing in the Supreme Court of Appeal. They haven't yet finished. They are still hearing submissions from counsel, and so of course one doesn't know which way it will go, and one doesn't want to preempt it. But certainly we hold the view that the entire decision by Fraser, as stated in the original judgment, was ultra vires, that he couldn't grant the medical parole and that it was set aside. And Mr. Zuma should return to prison to serve the rest of his sentence.
One of the big questions here that really faces the Department of Correctional Services is where it inherently believes the power to grant parole lies, whether that is with the Medical Parole Board or whether it is with the Commissioner. Do you think that there's going to have to be a process beyond this hearing that brings clarity to this matter? Because it's the legal representative of the Correctional Services Department that is making the argument that the final say, regardless of what the Medical Parole Board says, lies with the Commissioner. And that really seems to me a big issue that would need clarity going forward.
Well, Kathy, that's certainly something that we will traverse at the very next sitting of the Justice Portfolio Committee where Correctional Services is present. I hold the view that that's an erroneous approach. And the law is quite clear. There's no need for any extraneous procedures. The law is very clear. Medical parole must have a positive result from the Medical Parole Board. That's why there's a Medical Parole Board. That is why it was instituted after the Sheikh debacle, where medical parole was granted to a man who's clearly not medically unfit. And so the board was put in place in order to mitigate that kind of abuse of power, and all Fraser did was ignore them and ignore the institution of the Medical Parole Board, ignore the advice of a panel of medical experts, and just go right ahead and grant medical parole. So, you know, I don't believe any extraneous process is necessary. The law is adequate, and it's very clear that in the face of a negative finding by the Medical Parole Board, the Commissioner does not have the authority to grant the medical parole.
All right. Advocate Breytenbach, I'm going to save you the drama of having to throw any more objects and give you a chance to attend to the parking dog behind you. We'll leave it there for tonight. Portfolio Committee of Justice and Correctional Services member, Advocate Glynnis Breytenbach.